Hey everyone, Sumo Spiffy here. The July 2025 Basho is a few days past, which makes it time to dig into the performances of the tournament. And, roughly speaking, the more surprising the performance, the more we're gonna talk. To begin though, in past recaps, sometimes we've started with the injured guys just to get them out of the way. This time, we're doing it because they were as much the story of the Basho as the champ. Endo and Daisha were out, 8 other guys were definitely dealing with injuries, and by my count, 4 others may have been. So, the walking wounded going by rank. Hoshoryu. Obviously it was disappointing to see Hoshoryu get knocked out of another tournament. The fact his toe injury worsened is unfortunate, but not shocking in retrospect. Fingers crossed he'll recover well and not wind up in Wakamoto Haru land with his foot. But we'll get to Wakabro later. Meisei. Chris's injury video early in the Basho mentioned that Meisei's back problems were, back, and his performance reflected that. He seemed sort of okay pressing forward, but couldn't create much resistance when pushed back. It was so bad that even though injuries put him in line for a bunch of Sanyaku matches, the only one he ended up fighting was Oshoma, and he lost. Oof. Takeru Fuji. A lot of people, myself included, figured that when Takeru Fuji got hurt but kept fighting, he had a biceps muscle tear. Not good, but there are a number of stories of guys in the NFL, for example, with that type of injury who've kept playing, so the fact he continued wasn't surprising. But when he dropped, we found out it was a tendon tear. The only thing I hope is that the tendon tear didn't happen because he kept fighting. It's rare to see a sumo wrestler with tightness or flexibility issues that lead to injuries like this, but he's gotta find an answer to this problem. Tobizaru. Even though Toby went out after 12 days with an elbow injury, his right shoulder was a problem before that. It may not have been obvious, but look at this. On day 9, he came out with the shoulder all taped up. Nothing happened in his win over Chiyoshoma on day 8 that would indicate he hurt it then, and day 9 was the only day he used the tape. It was gone after that. Sometimes guys use this kinesio tape to keep things steady, even though everything's mostly fine. However, when someone doesn't use it, then uses it, then doesn't use it again, that's a pretty clear indication something is wrong and he's just trying whatever he can to get it to work correctly. I don't know if he heard it on an earlier day or if it was a problem coming in, but it was definitely causing issues. Ura. Pinky's injury affected his Basho less than anyone else's by far. He got hurt against Wakataka Kage on day 13 with his 8 wins already wrapped up. The Basho went pretty much as expected before that, with a fortunate bonus win over a one-armed Takeru Fuji midway. He was, as expected, a solid C+ pick, but it would have been nice to see if he could somehow get to 10 wins. Chiyoshoma. Apparently Chiyo had back surgery well before the Basho, and oh boy, that did not help him at all. He said after his win against Kaio that he's glad he didn't drop out, and fair enough, but are you glad you entered at all? Hidenoumi. Things already looked bad for Hidenoumi coming in, then he pulled a muscle on day 4 and missed 3 matches. He came back and made an effort, but it didn't result in much success. Hopefully Juryo welcomes him back with slightly gentler arms. Kotoeho. Considering he wrenched his elbow in the lead up to the Basho, Baby Koto didn't fare too badly. He was already quite an underdog overall, and it's not the height of success to beat dumpster fire Kaio, lackluster Hidenoumi, broken Chiyoshoma, and 2 Juryo guys as part of your 6 wins. But he did get wins where he should have been able to get them, and added a nice one over Shodai to the pile. He didn't seem quite ready for the big leagues coming in, and even with the injury he pretty clearly isn't, but he's probably not too far off. And now for the 4 guys who were of questionable health. Kirishima. Usually injury tier rankings are me hedging my bets against a guy's body falling apart. In Kiri's case, B injury tier was basically a description of his Basho. Getting yoinked by Aonishiki was his only loss during a 7-1 start, but sadly that was followed by a 1-6 finish. I'm not straight up calling him injured because when I say a guy was injured, I mean he has a new injury or an old one that's becoming more of a problem than usual. Editing bay spiff here. Turns out Kirishima was fighting with a fever at the end of the Basho. It was 40 degrees Celsius, or for all of us Americans, 104 degrees Fahrenheit. Absolutely insane. So he was definitely messed up, and we can make him the 9th guy dealing with some kind of physical issue. Wakamoto Haru. Waka's foot hasn't been quite right since he messed up his toe like a year ago, but this time he seemed more flat-footed than usual. It can be hard to tell though, because a slip or a loss of balance might be just that. He did what's becoming normal for him, struggle against the big dogs and come back at the end, and his 6 wins made him fit in as a C- pick. But even though we've gotten used to him having downswings then popping back up to the Sanyaku, I wonder if the heightened competition will keep him out of the upper echelon going forward. Shishi. When Chris's injury video said Shishi was feeling better from his back issues in May, I didn't have a reason to question it, but he sure as hell didn't fight like he felt better. What we saw, I think, was a guy at less than 100%, but who was able to salvage a decent record with a lot of favorable matchups at the end. He probably should have finished with a winning record, except his fingers got caught in Midori Fuji's hair. Those favorable matchups, though, were against Chiyoshoma and a lot of noticeably smaller opponents, which is his wheelhouse. He can't rely on that saving him all the time. So, until and unless he makes some noticeable improvements to his game, he's looking like someone who needs to be at close to full health to maybe compete in Makuuchi. Kinbozan. I expected very little out of Kinbozan, and he delivered even more, or less, I guess, than anticipated. What makes me question his health, though, is the fact he threw 3 Henkas during the tournament, including 2 and 3 days near the end. None of them worked because he's god-awful at Henkas, but he kept trying. Even when we've known he's hurt, he doesn't do that. He just stands in and gets his ass beat. I keep thinking it would be very Kinbozan to do something bananas out of desperation because nothing else is working, but the more I think about it, the more likely it seems that his ability to take contact diminished for some reason as the basho went on. But I don't know anything for sure. Okay, let's talk about some relatively healthy wrestlers. We'll start with the predictions we got right. And yes, I am setting this up so I can say nice things about Tamawashi and Mitakeumi at the end. Kusano. I said maybe 10, but probably 11 wins. He got 11 wins. It couldn't have gone more as expected than it did. He lost to a couple of good opponents before he hit the Sanyaku, ended up with 3 Sanyaku opponents, and beat 1. Even though the breakdown I made pointed out issues he was having, the basic expectation never changed. To his credit, after the first week, he stopped getting banged around as easily. His win over Fujinokawa looked worse than any of his losses. If there was a difference between what I expected and what happened, it's that it only took him about a week to find his footing rather than a full basho. He did good. Wakataka Kage. Despite Waka's 12 wins in May, I expected 8 to 10 wins here because the matchups didn't get any easier. All the same, I still didn't expect him to start out 3 and 4, and I sure as hell didn't expect him to lose to Tamawashi. Once he got through that first week though, it was smooth sailing. Most of the matchups were very good for him, even Kotozakura, and he handled Kusano cleanly. The Ozeki run is real. 11 wins in September should see him finally make it there. Kotozakura. Koto swung another 8 wins, but this can't keep happening. If you want a damning statistic, forget the fact he's an Ozeki that can't seem to crack 8 wins. In this basho, Oshoma and Kinbozan combined for 7 wins, and he was 2 of them. They're not especially bad matchups for him either. That just can't happen. Takanosho, Gonoyama, Churinaumi, and Shodai. 4 C+ picks, 4 9 and 6 records. You pretty much know what you're getting with Takanosho. The only thing that occasionally happens is he does what you expect, but it works way better than usual for reasons no one can ascertain. He showed his class, beat everyone he should have beaten, and even earned a yeeting up the Banzuke to fight Abi near the end. It would have been unfortunate if his great start slumped to another 8 and 7, but beating Shodai on the last day earned him a solid 9 wins. Gonoyama, on the other hand, remains absolutely maddening even when he's doing well. When everything's clicking, which it was most of the time this tournament, you wonder why he's not at least battling for a Sanyaku spot every time out. But then he takes more aggravating losses, like falling into slapdown traps against Meisei and Oho, and it's like, oh, right, it's Gonoyama. Of course that's gonna happen. Churinaumi finally escaped his personal statistical anomaly and managed to finish with single digits in both wins and losses. Hooray! It looked rough at first, losing to Shodai for the first time in 4 matches, but it turned out Shodai was feeling pretty good. Chura's overall basho was a good look at what makes him a stable Makuuchi wrestler. 3 of his other 5 losses were to the champ and 2 guys who took the Jun Yusho. And even though he benefited from some guys struggling, he had very solid wins against Gonoyama and Mitakeumi in the second week. And yet, despite this very creditable performance, I still feel like I have no idea what he'll do in September. As for Shodai, that sure was a Shodai basho. Usually when we say things like that, it's because he managed to fail in some spectacular way, but I think it's just as true here after a successful tournament. He started 3-3, then somehow managed to land a schedule of fights that, for him, were essentially unlosable. These were his final 6 wins: Mid-Disaster Shishi, Kaio, Sada no Umi, One-Armed Takeru Fuji, Chiyoshoma, and Roga. Roga was the only competent opponent of the bunch, and Shodai's now 3-0 against him. Yeah, the schedule gets weird sometimes, but like, Chiyo had to fight Shodai, who's blasted him their whole careers, and not Hidenoumi, even though Chiyo and Hidenoumi combined for 3 total wins. Yeah, Shodai also had to fight Koto Shoho, Atami, and Takanosho, and lost all of those. And yes, you still have to beat the guys they put in front of you, no matter how badly they're doing. But he would have been hard-pressed to write himself a nicer schedule. Asa Koryu. Kinda like Shishi, Asa was a technically correct pick, but one that it's hard to feel good about. He worked his little ass off, but fight after fight he just couldn't finish the job. After the loss to Kaio dropped him to 2-8, he got pretty damn lucky that so many other guys were also collapsing around him. But 6 wins is 6 wins, so he's still got some wiggle room in the division come next Basho. Roga, on the other hand, epitomized the C- tier. He struggled early, taking a couple somewhat surprising losses, then turned 2-4 into 7-4 on the backs of some of the walking wounded. Then, when such a strong record earned him fights with a higher caliber of opponent, he imploded again, cratering down to 7-8 for a womp womp Makekoshi. Rogue is not quite as predictable as Takanosho as far as expected results, but he's definitely steering into that lane. Hiradeumi. If I had to describe Hiradeumi's Basho, it would be fine. Thing is, it's hard to gauge anything off his results. Except for Wakamoto Haru, all his losses were to monsters he usually struggles against, so the fact he still managed a winning record looks pretty good. But now that the Basho is over and we know how healthy or not certain guys were, I'm not sure if any of the wins he had were impressive outside of Ichi Yamamoto and Gonoyama. And Gonoyama's someone he used to smash until Gono took their last 2 fights before this tournament. He's fun to watch because he's always game, and I'm reluctant to doubt him in September because he frequently does better than pure reason says he should. But next Basho does look like it might be rough. Toki Hayate. This was a pretty average Basho for Toki. He definitely wants that Hidenoumi fight back, but other than that, all his losses were to guys I'd expect him to struggle with. And the wins were pretty good. Apologies to the Toki fans who were hoping to hear something a little more in-depth. He just did what we usually see him do, and it worked about as well as we should expect against the guys he fought. Consistency. Hakuoho. I had Hakuoho at the bottom of C-, so it's fair enough to say that this prediction was technically correct but wrong in spirit. And he did look stronger overall than I expected. But in terms of results, to me, this whole thing swung on the Onosato fight. He started 3-4, and neither the wins nor losses were surprising. Then he went directly at Onosato's face. There were a lot of criticisms, justifiably so, of Onosato for backpedaling so much during the tournament. But Hakuoho is not generally the guy who will make you do that. Maybe this is the difference in having Teruno Fuji, the new Izegahama, as your coach. And if that's the case, maybe we've got some strategic fun ahead of us between Hakuoho and Aonishiki. Onokatsu. Kicking off the correct D tiers is the guy who seemed like the safest bet in the Joy to not get it done. No respect to Onokatsu. He's good, he's learning, and it won't always be like this. But from the time he hit the top of Juryo, he's needed match experience to figure out what to do at each new level. Not being a mega powerhouse like Kusano or an actual freak like Aonishiki, it's gonna take him longer to acclimatize to new levels of difficulty. He'll be back, but if he continues to struggle at this level, we might have found his ceiling. Oho. If you're surprised by this pick being correct, I don't know who you're watching. Yeah, Oho finished 7-8, but consider, dude was Makekoshi on day 12 at 4-8. But because it's Oho, those 4 wins were against Mega Failbado Shoma, Broken Meisei, and the friggin' 2 Yokozuna. Yeah, he got a walkover over Hoshoryu, but that's been a winnable matchup for him. And the 3 wins at the end included Gonoyama and Hakuoho, not a trio of walkovers. He is, without question, still the most inexplicable Rikishi in the sport. And I hope he enjoys that title, cause it's gonna be a while before he sniffs an Emperor's Cup. Sada no Umi. When a guy craters as hard as Sada no Umi, you gotta wonder if he's hurt. But I didn't add him to those lists because, realistically, he was outmatched at basically every turn in this Basho. That's not to say he wasn't hurt, maybe he was, but the only guys he was actually good against historically going into this tournament were Tobizaru and Atami Fuji, and even his numbers there weren't exactly dominant. Somehow it turned out even worse than it looked like it would be going in, but it never looked good. Oshoma. Somehow I was right and wrong at the same time with Oshoma. D tier, no question. He wasn't getting to 8 wins as a Komusubi, no way. But I thought 6 was reasonable. There were enough guys he's shown himself capable of beating floating around that I thought for sure he'd avoid the 4-11 disaster from the first time he reached the Joy. But somehow he was even worse. Hell, maybe he was hurt, I don't know. But more likely, he's really not good enough for this level. Like, extra not good enough. Maybe the extraordinary determination he showed at the end of May was because that one Komusubi tournament locks in certain benefits for him after his career, and he knew he might never get another chance. He sure didn't fight like he planned on staying. Now let's touch on the small errors. Onosato, predicted S tier, ended at A tier. If I was doing the tier list the old way, there'd be no change because he was obviously the best of the Sanyaku. But now that I said S tier is 12 wins, I can't keep him there. All the same, it's not like he did badly, it was only disappointing because of who he is. The fact all 4 of his losses were Kinboshi shouldn't matter either. For whatever reason, some of those Maegashira guys are simply harder for him to beat than his Sanyaku brethren. All that being said, it very much looked like he felt the pressure. Pulldowns and slapdowns for Onosato are something we see when he's uncomfortable if not a little desperate. After he hit 2 losses, Tamawashi dragged him down largely because he didn't let his feet catch up with the rest of his body as he pushed. That's an old issue he's mostly overcome, but it came back here. And against Kota Shoho, just watch these fights. This is from November 2023. Onosato pushes to start, but Kota Shoho gets away. It looks like Onosato's in control, then Koto gets a little knee bump, hefts Onosato around, and yoinks him down. Next one is the playoff from that same basho. Onosato tries to get his hand inside, Kota Shoho steps away, and does essentially the same move as the first time. I highlighted these fights in the Onosato breakdown I did way back when. And now day 13 of this tournament. Onosato pushes, Kota Shoho gets the knee bump again, and try as he might, Onosato can't hang on. On the flip side, Onosato's 2 wins over Koto and Makuuchi were basically big push blowouts. All credit to Koto for winning this time, but it's hard to watch Onosato lose the exact same way he did in Juryo to the exact same guy twice and not conclude he had a serious mental boom. Yet, even getting sidetracked and falling into some old bad habits, Onosato still finished 11-4. This is why he'll be a favorite for as long as his body holds up. Abi, Ichi Yamamoto, and Midori Fuji. I had all 3 placed somewhere in C-, 6 to 8 wins, and they all finished 9-6. So we bump them all to C+, but their paths were just a little bit different. Abi Hanked Onokatsu, got hanked by Kiri like Kiri was trying to prove a point, and then went and hanked Wakataka Kage, and that was just the first 3 days. That led to at least a handful of people wondering if his arms were all messed up, which has been a problem. And to be honest, he never looked all that on point. Even as he continually maintained no worse than a 50-50 record, it was off those 2 Henkas, Busted Hoshoryu, Wakamoto Haru, who he's gone back to dominating, Meisei, Oshoma, and Oho. For a guy at Maegashira 2, that's not exactly Murderer's Row. And because he was the only guy around his rank doing well but not in the Yusho race, Takanosho and Midori Fuji got called up to fight him near the end. Shodai had a friendly schedule, but that makes sense at the bottom of the division. Abi's 9 wins look like a miracle. It's hard to say the same about Ichi's 9, of course, considering he got him in the first 10 days. Sure, he got a little fortunate with Tobizaru, Takeru Fuji, and Meisei all being injured since he usually does poorly against them, but that led to him getting a massive schedule upgrade the rest of the way. And as we've seen in the past, Ichi does not handle those upgrades well. So, if he lost a couple more matches early, it's quite possible he still would have finished with 9 wins or so because the challenge wouldn't have escalated so severely or so quickly. And he was fighting well. He was aggressive as always, but his strikes were accurate and everything looked really effective even in his losses to tougher opposition. Losing 5 straight to finish isn't fun, but he has reason to be proud of his overall performance. As for Midori, I think what we're seeing is that unless the guys coming up from Juryo are legit and should be expected to stay in Makuuchi for a while, he can take advantage when he's at rank 11 or 12. Once he got through the guys around his rank and dipped down to 15, 16, 17, he showed how clearly better he is than them. His only loss to that group was to Matakeyumi, but Matakeyumi was absolutely rolling, so no shame there. Likewise, losing to Gonoyama and Abi at the end wasn't surprising either. Midori's probably going to stay a steady rank 8 to 12 or so for the foreseeable future. Kaio. Prediction C-. Outcome maximum D tier. He was so bad that thinking he had even the slightest chance at 8 wins feels like a blown pick. I wanted his performance out of my brain so badly that I forgot to include him in this script until it was done. Just, dude, get back to Juryo and stay there until you figure out why nobody runs races in reverse. And now, the part I put at the end partly for watch time, but mostly for shame, the big misses. Aonishiki. Yeah, I'm starting with Aonishiki instead of Kotoshoho because, frankly, this pick feels like more of a whiff. The prediction was 6 to 8 wins. After I published the tier list, I started thinking about it and felt like he was probably more likely to get 9 wins than 6, so I should have had him like low C+, 7 to 9 wins. But when the dude starts 11 and 2, that difference stops mattering. Your ass was just wrong. So, okay, why did I have him hovering around Kachikoshi? Very simply, he was 0-4 against the Sanyaku before the tournament, and that was without ever facing either Yokozuna. More importantly, he'd shown vulnerability to big pushing attacks. With so many dominant pushers in the upper ranks, some of them had to beat him, right? In fact, no, they didn't have to beat him, and they didn't beat him. Well, Onosato did, but Oho couldn't do it, Kinbozan couldn't, Abi, Tamawashi, Ichi Yamamoto, none of them broke through. It certainly helped that Daisho wasn't around. Until proven otherwise, I think Daisho is the most dangerous opponent for Aonishiki outside of Onosato. That's not a knock on Hoshoryu either. It's a comment on how bad of a matchup Daisho is for Aonishiki. I also expected some of the top-level grapplers to give him trouble, especially Waka Prime, but the Waka matches where he attacked and didn't fall back into his favored grappling stance. In fact, his strategic approach to the Sanyaku matches was light years ahead of what we usually see. Aside from Waka, neither Kotozakura nor Kiri were ready for his Uchimuso, bum-rushing Hoshoryu wound up being the perfect plan, Oshoma, well, he was always going to win that, and the strats didn't stop there. Hitting the quick slapdown against Kinbozan, while maybe obvious in retrospect, is not a strategy he really ever employs, but it was the right move in this case and he nailed it. The question now is if he and Coach Ajigawa can continually add these strategic wrinkles to keep his opponents off balance. As we saw with Kusano and Kotoshoho, solid wrestlers who are bigger, stronger, and know how to abuse that size difference may be his real kryptonite. They also used his tendency to duck his head against him, which might become the biggest problem of all. But Team Ajigawa's got a month and a half to come up with some answers. Kotoshoho, the winner, new champion, and for the channel's purposes, the only S-tier wrestler in July. Holy shit. And Kotoshoho is the absolute rarest of sumo champions, a somewhat forgotten veteran who came out of nowhere, who was not just deserving of the title, but someone we should now expect to continue succeeding at higher ranks. Let me be absolutely clear, because there are still a lot of comments about him being one of the worst champions ever. He may have one of the least inspiring resumes of any champion, but this Kotoshoho, the one that showed up in July, is not one of the worst. He was a legitimate force. So how did this happen? The main thing is that he got bigger and stronger. It's not super obvious because he's always been pretty big, but looking at him from a few years ago versus now, he's definitely bulked up. And we sometimes forget this about the guys who start pro sumo out of high school. He's been around for so long, but he's still only 25. This is when his body should get to where it's meant to be. I mean, how often have we ever seen Kotoshoho diesel a dude out like this? And a big quality wrestler at that. Combine that with his legs and ankles obviously feeling good enough to pull off this kind of footwork, and you've got a dangerous guy rolling up the ranks. Atami Fuji and Takayasu. The guys I had at C injury tier alongside Kotoshoho stonked out almost as hard. However, where Kotoshoho's success was a surprise because he's rarely been this competitive in Makuuchi, these two were a surprise because their reasons for being listed in the injury tier were much more significant. When Atami blew up in the back half of 2023, winning 11 matches 3 straight times en route to a Juryo title and 2 Jun Yushos, much more was expected. And he managed to hang with the big boys for a full year, never succeeding enough to reach the Sanyaku, but not failing enough to avoid fighting them. Then news of his arthritic hip broke around the time he went 5-10 and finally cratered out of the joy. We knew he had the physical capacity to blow through mid-rank and lower wrestlers when healthy, but after he went 6-9 at Maegashira 8 and barely scratched out 8 wins at rank 12, it looked like we should just expect him to spin his wheels around this level. Truth be told, that's probably correct as a long-term view. Arthritic joints might feel better from time to time, but they don't get better. I actually wonder if the heat in Nagoya helped him get warmer and suffer less from whatever arthritis symptoms he has. If that's the case, September might end up being disastrous. But we're talking about July, and this sparkling 11-win Basho is something he's always theoretically capable of. It's just not something we can expect. Broadly speaking, Takayasu is in a similar place. For what it's worth, he's the main reason I stopped talking about what injury tier guys should do when healthy and focused more on what I expect to actually happen. It just got too problematic to discuss how he can be a dominant force, but we can only guess if his back will allow it to happen. The reason for tagging him C- is pretty simple. The last time his schedule actually started against largely Sanyaku opponents and he didn't get hurt was November 2023. The last one before that was November 2022. In that time frame, he was Kyujo for at least part of 5 other Bashos with a similar schedule. In fairness to Papa Bear, reports indicate he's been trying to find ways to ensure his back stays healthy for a full Basho. But after May, where he was obviously not okay despite staying in the whole time, there was no reason to believe whatever methods he's used have been especially effective. The fact everything held together this time was as surprising as it was fun to see. The way he came out blasting the last 2 days was incredible. I assume it'll keep being a roll of the dice whether he can do that in any given tournament from now on, but I'm always happy to be wrong about him doing well. Fuji no Kawa. I think that if I had known Fuji had put on weight before I made the tier list, I'd probably have listed him at C+ instead of C-. After all, size was one of my core concerns. But with 10 wins, even that prediction would have been wrong, so he definitely goes in the whiff category. I assumed, like with most guys who aren't overwhelming physical specimens, that he would need some time to get used to the higher level of competition. He might figure it out mid-Basho, but he'd still eat some losses in the meantime. But not only did he put up a very impressive record, there's not much to criticize in terms of his schedule. None of his losses were bad, even the one to Kaio, who only seems able to beat the small or the immobile. On the flip side, he was one of Kota Shoho's 2 losses. Beating 6-0 Matakayumi looked like it was the start of Matakayumi losing steam, but that win looks much better in light of Matakayumi's strong finish. Hell, if he'd lost to Takanosho and Ichi Yamamoto the last 2 days and finished 8-7, he could have still considered this a successful Basho. Beating him not only put a pair of feathers in his top knot, but it won him an extra 20 grand. The sky might not be the limit because he can't reach that high, but I wonder if we finally have a short stuff guy who can hang in the upper ranks for more than a year. Tamawashi. From D tier to A tier. Misses this bad are quite rare and worth taking apart. How did I mess this up so badly? Part of it, of course, is the injury situation. He didn't face Hoshoryu, who he's been historically disastrous against. He won his previous match against Meisei, but had lost 4 straight to him in 2024, so that looked bad going in. He lost 3 straight to Kinbozan, and those 2 ended up being no match for hardly anyone. But that's only 2 bad matchups he won and a 3rd he dodged. And except for Ichi Yamamoto at the end, he didn't fight anyone below Gonoyama in the rankings, so he never got to pick on Tobizaru, Sadanoumi, or Chiyoshima, even though they were fairly close in rank. Thus, it's not just the injury issues. Well, what else? He was previously 0-3 against Onosato, 3-9 against Wakataka Kage, and even though that matchup has been closer since Waka won the first 5 between them, it still didn't look good. Winning both of those was remarkable, but he also lost for the first time in 3 to Onokatsu, so that pendulum swung against him too. Nothing on paper stands out as a clear reason he did so unbelievably well. What it comes down to, I think, is flow. I don't like leaning on that or ideas like it because it chalks results up to some ephemeral concept rather than anything we can look at and say, hey, that was different from the usual. But once Tamawashi was 4-0, especially after beating those problematic opponents in Meisei and Kinbozan, he looked like he was ready to throw down with anyone. He knows as well as anybody that if you're gonna compete in sumo, you need to get off to a good start, and what we saw was a guy who had every intention of taking the opportunity presented to him. I've seen comments about Wakataka Kage being more motivated now that he's on an Ozeki run, but I don't think that's much of a source of strength. When you're at these ranks, you cannot fight at a level where extra motivation will make you that much better. But sumo is a sport with such fine lines between success and failure that in a matchup of relative equals, a little more confidence can make you hit a little harder, move a little faster, and give you a bit more chance to win. And if those extra percentage points keep hitting, your confidence grows and it snowballs. That's what we saw with Tamawashi in July. If you think that's not really a thing, that's okay. But riddle me this. Tamawashi and Oshoma each had 2 wins against each other going into their day 15 match, and it was a pretty close fight. But did anyone ever doubt that Tamawashi would win? And finally, we get to arguably the biggest and genuinely the nicest surprise of the Basho, Takayumi and his 10 wins. Was it a surprise to see him start well? No, not at all. He usually does that. I figured he'd split Kotoeho and Shishi to start 3-1, but winning both and starting 4-0, not a stunner. Beating Kota Shoho, however, was. Even at the time, when Kota Shoho was only 3-2, it was quite shocking because Koto routinely blasted Takayumi even when he was hanging around mid-Maegashira. Day 5 Takayumi is usually still strong, but that looked like the one match he'd lose. Instead, he absolutely handled Koto. And you even see with his little hop at the end that win must have felt really good. Beating Shodai after that wasn't even a little surprising, and suddenly Takayumi was 6-0. Now, let's set the stage of expectations versus reality. A 4-2 start would have seemed perfectly normal. 5-1 would have been good, but still with the expectation of a major fall-off. At 6-0, it was harder to know what to expect because Takayumi embodied what I talked about with Tamawashi, but even more so. If Tamawashi fell off and was only 6-9, whatever, he drops a few ranks and comes back next time. If Takayumi does that, he's back in Juryo. So now, for whatever reason, he feels good, everything's clicking, and he's gonna grab this chance by the throat. Then he loses to Fujinokawa and Takano Sho. Tough opponents, of course, but if you've seen him recently, you could see the fade on the horizon. And Midori Fuji was next, who'd really started handling Takayumi since he fell into the divisional yo-yo. Takayumi fans had good cause for concern. But he won that one and had Shona Naomi next, who he completely owns. He was getting his Kachikoshi ASAP, and that D-tier prediction went wrong in a hurry. I was just as impressed with how he finished though. No, he didn't beat Kusano or Atami, but realistically he was never going to. Takayumi's body is what it is, and at this point, it has limitations no snowball of confidence will overcome. And his wins at the end against Roga and Toki Hayate were in pretty good matchups for him. But lately, it hasn't necessarily mattered how good he usually is against someone. If he fights him near the end of the Basho, it always feels like something's gonna go wrong. But he didn't let that happen this time. He finished as strong as he could and set himself up to spend at least a couple more tournaments in Makuuchi as long as he, doesn't completely implode in September. And that is the tier list recap for July 2025. Congrats again to Kota Shoho on a very well-fought Yusho, and congrats to all of us for being fans in this time of sumo. The coming months should be a lot of fun, so look forward to that. Have a great day, and I'll see you soon.